At the heart of a courtroom steeped in mystery and challenges, a brilliant young Mexican dared to confront the system, leaving the judge utterly speechless with his remarkable courage and insight. The sky had turned an angry purple by the time Marta Rivera reached the abandoned Westlake Observatory. Rain lashed against her face as she fumbled with the rusted padlock, her fingers trembling not from the cold, but from what she was about to face. Behind her, headlights cut through the darkness, tires crunching on gravel. Time was running out. She finally broke the lock with a decisive blow from a rock and pushed through the heavy metal door. The musty darkness inside enveloped her like an old enemy. Marta's flashlight beam danced across abandoned equipment and dusty control panels. This place had once been her sanctuary, her future. Now it felt like a tomb. "I know you're in here," a voice called from outside. Richard Tavares, her former mentor, the man who had stolen everything. Marta moved quickly to the center of the observatory dome. The massive telescope, once state-of-the-art, now stood as a silent witness to what had happened here 12 years ago. She pulled the tarp off the main control panel, coughing as dust billowed around her. The small device in her backpack felt impossibly heavy as she removed it. Years of work, sacrifice and obsession condensed into something that fit in her palm. "Whatever you're planning, it won't bring them back," Tavares said, now standing in the doorway, rain dripping from his expensive coat. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the storm, his posture confident. Power had always looked good on him. "This isn't about bringing anyone back," Marta replied, connecting the device to the old system. "It's about the truth." Tavares took a step forward, his expression a careful mixture of concern and authority. The same look he'd given her when he'd announced to the world that her research was fundamentally flawed. The same look when he'd accepted the Brenner Prize for his groundbreaking work in quantum acoustics. Her work. "The observatory is scheduled for demolition tomorrow," he said, voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Whatever point you're trying to make a..." "They'll hear it," Marta interrupted, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Everyone will." Outside, thunder crashed. Inside, the old machinery groaned to life. 12 years earlier, Marta Rivera had been the rising star of the physics department at Westlake University. At 32, she'd already published 3 groundbreaking papers on quantum acoustics, the study of how sound waves interact with quantum fields. Her theory of echo resonance suggested that sound didn't simply disappear after it faded from human hearing. It left quantum imprints that could be detected, amplified, and potentially used to map historical events through their acoustic remnants. The university had granted her exclusive use of the observatory to build her experimental array, a complex system of quantum sensors designed to capture these fading echoes. For 3 years, she worked tirelessly, often sleeping on the small cot she'd installed in the corner of the control room. Richard Tavares had been the department chair, a distinguished physicist whose best work was decades behind him. He'd initially been supportive, securing her funding and defending her research against skeptical colleagues. Marta had trusted him completely. "Your potential is limitless," he'd told her one evening as they reviewed her data. His hand had rested on her shoulder a moment too long. "We make quite the team." Marta remembered smiling uncomfortably, shrugging away from his touch to point at her readings. "Look at this pattern. It's exactly what I predicted. Sound waves from the construction work last month still resonating at the quantum level." Tavares had nodded, eyes lingering on her rather than the data. "You should present this at the International Physics Symposium next month. I've already recommended you as a speaker." The memory still burned. How naively grateful she'd been, how blind to his true intentions. 2 weeks before the symposium, the lab fire had destroyed everything. Her equipment, her backup drives, her physical notes. The official report cited electrical failure. Marta had been home for the first time in days, finally getting proper sleep at the insistence of her research assistant, Isabel. Isabel, who had died trying to save their work. When Marta returned to campus, devastated, guilt-ridden but determined to rebuild, Tavares had called her into his office. The university board had concerns, he explained. The fire investigation raised questions about her lab safety protocols. Her funding was suspended pending review. Take some time off, he'd suggested with practiced sympathy. Grief can cloud judgment. 6 months later, Richard Tavares unveiled his revolutionary work in quantum acoustics at the same symposium, where Marta should have presented. His novel theory of resonance mapping was immediately hailed as visionary. When journalists noted similarities to Dr. Rivera's previous publications, Tavares explained that her early work had shown promise, but ultimately followed a flawed methodology. He'd merely corrected her course. Without her notes and data, without institutional support, Marta couldn't prove the theft. Tavares had methodically dismantled her credibility while she was at her most vulnerable. Former colleagues avoided her calls. Academic journals rejected her papers. The promising career she'd built crumbled to dust. Marta left academia, taking a job calibrating industrial sound equipment. At night, she rebuilt her research from memory, working in the garage of her small apartment. For 12 years, she lived like a ghost, haunted by what had been taken from her, and by Isabel's unnecessary death. Until 3 months ago, when she discovered that Tavares had never actually replicated her results. His subsequent research had stalled because he'd stolen her conclusions without understanding the methodology. His career had been built on scientific fraud, and now the university was demolishing the observatory to build a new research center, the Tavares Institute for Quantum Studies. "Step away from the controls, Marta," Tavares said, moving closer. "You're not well." Marta ignored him, continuing her work. The old telescope motor hummed as the dome began to rotate. "I've reviewed all your recent purchases," he continued. "Industrial transmitters, quantum field generators. Whatever you've built, it won't work. You know that, right?" "You never understood the core principle," Marta replied without looking up. "That's why you've been stuck for years, publishing minor variations of my original work while pretending to make progress. You're a fraud, Richard." His composed facade cracked slightly. "The board won't reinstate you if that's what you're hoping. They've moved on. Everyone has moved on except you." Marta finally turned to face him, her expression calm despite the storm raging inside her. At 44, her face showed the strain of her obsession, deepened lines around her eyes, silver streaking her once black hair. But there was something else there too: certainty. "I'm not trying to get my old job back," she said. "I'm completing my work." The device she'd connected to the observatory systems was her life's work distilled, a quantum resonance amplifier that could capture and broadcast the echoes lingering in this very room. Conversations, arguments, the crackling of flames. Isabel's final moments. "You said sound leaves quantum imprints," Tavares said, his voice taking on a nervous edge. "Even if that were true, we both know it's true. You built your career on it. Those imprints would be too weak to detect after 12 years. Marta smiled thinly. "That's where you've been wrong all along. The imprints don't weaken over time. They become more deeply embedded in the quantum field, like fossils." Outside, car doors slammed. Tavares glanced over his shoulder, then back at Marta with renewed confidence. "Security is here. This has gone far enough." Marta pressed the final key. The amplifier hummed to life. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "This won't bring Isabel back." The air in the observatory seemed to thicken, vibrating with invisible energy. And then, like a radio tuning to a distant station, sounds began to fill the room. Ghostly voices, fragments of conversations, echoes from the past becoming audible once more. Tavares froze, his face draining of color, as his own voice emerged from the quantum static. "Need to make sure she's not here tonight. Replace the wiring in the east section. With her gone, all this becomes our work, understand?" A woman's voice responded, Isabel, frightened but defiant. "This is Marta's research. I won't let you—" The sound of a struggle, a scream cut short. The security team burst through the door just as Tavares lunged for the amplifier. Marta stepped back, watching as the man who had destroyed her life tried desperately to silence the truth once again. But it was too late. The device wasn't just playing these echoes in the observatory. It was broadcasting them to every quantum receiver at the university, and to the journalists Marta had anonymously contacted earlier that day. As security pulled Tavares away from the equipment, Marta caught his eye. "Sound waves never really die," she said softly. "They just wait to be heard again." 2 months after the night at the observatory, Marta stood outside the newly renamed Isabel Hernandez Center for Quantum Studies. The criminal investigation into Tavares was still ongoing, but the evidence captured by Marta's device, combined with financial records showing he had arranged the lab fire, had been damning enough for the university to act swiftly. The university president had personally offered Marta her old position with substantial compensation for the years of lost work. Her original papers had been reattributed, citations corrected across academic databases. The scientific community had rallied around her, condemning Tavares and celebrating her resilience. Yet as she stood there, Marta felt strangely hollow. Vindication, she had discovered, wasn't the same as healing. "Are you coming in?" asked Judge Thomas Blackwell, now serving on the university's ethics committee, appearing at the entrance. "Everyone's waiting to hear from you." Inside, the lecture hall was packed with students and faculty. As Marta walked to the podium, she saw faces filled with admiration, curiosity, even awe. The weight of their expectations pressed against her. For 12 years she had lived for this moment, the return, the restoration of her name. She had imagined it would feel like triumph. Instead, she felt the crushing awareness of time lost, of paths not taken, of the person she might have become without the burden of her obsession. She looked down at her prepared speech about quantum acoustics and future research directions. Then, with a deep breath, she set it aside. "Before I talk about science," Marta began, "I want to talk about echoes of a different kind, the ones we carry inside us." In the back of the hall, a late arrival slipped in. Miguel Hernandez, her nephew, the young law prodigy who had helped build her legal case against Tavares. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. "For 12 years I let anger echo through every part of my life," Marta continued. "I thought vindication would silence those echoes, but standing here now, I realize it's not about silencing the past, it's about choosing which echoes we amplify going forward." Outside, rain began to fall again, drumming softly against the windows of the lecture hall. Marta looked out at the faces watching her. Young researchers with careers ahead of them, colleagues who had doubted and now supported her, and felt something unexpected breaking loose inside her chest. Not closure exactly, but perhaps the beginning of a different kind of resonance. "So today," she said, her voice growing stronger, "we start a new conversation, one that will leave its own echoes for the future." And somewhere in the quantum field that connected all things, these words too became part of the endless pattern of sound and silence, loss and discovery, endings and beginnings, echoes waiting for someone to listen.